Did the guy that everyone said helped write the Bible actually write the Bible? Well, his name is Peter, and you need to stick around in this episode to find out if he actually wrote the letters that are in his name. Plus, we're going to talk about things like deportation, a little bit of immigration, and how that actually changed the face of the early church. And finally, how did a letter that was written by an uneducated, unlearned, kind of goofy fisherman actually shape the earliest centuries of Christianity? This is Theology Threads, and you're going to want to stick around to find out. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Theology Threads, Series 4. I'm super excited about this one, but before we go any farther, don't forget, hit that like button, click that subscribe button. Make sure you get that little bell for notifications. That's a pretty important thing if you're with us on YouTube. Also, take time to share the fact that you're watching or enjoying or listening to Theology Threads today. And don't forget to follow us on social media. So, with that being said, I want to talk for a little bit as we kick off this new series, why I chose 1st, 2nd Peter, and if we're lucky, that quirky little book called Jude to focus on. A few years ago, I was just looking through books of the Bible, trying to figure out what I was going to study personally, and I realized that I'd never done any great work on the letters of Peter. I just hadn't. For some reason, it had never come up in sermons. It had never come up I never took a class on it, anything like that. Actually, that's a lie. Now that I remember, I did take a class on it at Bible College, Central Bible College. May she rest in peace. So I just really felt like, man, there's work in these great letters of Peter that I don't feel like I'd ever really done, and I'd never really heard. Like, I'd never been in churches where they did sermon series on them or anything like that. Flash forward to a couple of years ago, I was doing a baptism service, and I was reading through the book, and I came across, I was reading through just trying to get inspiration for the baptism service, and for some reason, felt the Spirit draw me to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, and it was this verse: "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you might proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Listen to this. This was the verse that got me, and I thought it was awesome for baptism in particular. "Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you had received mercy." And there was something about the transformational aspect of that verse. There was something about the journey aspect of that verse that just, I don't know, maybe you've been reading the Bible, maybe if you've been reading the Bible for a while, every once in a while, a verse just kind of seals into your heart a little bit. And for some reason, that verse just reached out and grabbed me. And so I have been, I guess for lack of a better term, flirting with doing a study on the Peter letters, and then Jude always kind of gets lumped in with them for a while now. And so when we were talking as a team about what to do for this 4th series of Theology Threads, I was like, let's do it. 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and possibly Jude. And you say, why do you keep throwing Jude in there? Jude's one chapter. We can do it in like 2 episodes, and it's got some of the most insane, crazy stuff in it that you could possibly imagine. So what we're going to do in this particular session today is really talk about the who, what, when, where, and the why. In other words, how to read these 2 letters. So if you want to go back to season 3, we have an episode on how to read the Bible. And in that episode, we talk about the 4 big questions. What does it say? What did it mean? What does it mean? And what do I do? So what I want to do is now give you some better skills to use and better questions to ask when you get to the what did it mean section of it. And that's the who, what, when, where, and why. So we always start out with this question: who wrote it? Who wrote it? The author of any given book in the Bible is probably the most critical part of understanding it beyond just the content itself. And you would say, well, Brian, come on, it's called 1 Peter, 2 Peter, should be pretty obvious who wrote it. Aha, not so fast, my friend. I was shocked at how disputed the authorship of the Petrine, that's the fancy letters, but the Peter letters really is. So there's sort of 3 challenges as to whether or not Peter was the actual author. So I'm going to tell you those 3 challenges, and then I'm going to tell you why those 3 challenges are actually pretty dumb reasons, and it's really just people overthinking it. But before I tell you why all these reasons are wrong, let me give you the reasons right now. The first reason that people say, well, Peter couldn't have written 1st and 2nd Peter is because the Greek is too good. Peter was, as we know, an unschooled, unlearned fisherman from Galilee. He would not have really been that conversant in Greek. That's just a historical fact. And if we're honest, go back, read the Gospels, read the book of Acts. Peter's not always the sharpest tool in the shed. I'm from Arkansas. I feel like if I were a disciple, a lot of times I would just look at the other disciples after Peter said something and say, bless his heart. Like that's the type of guy Peter is. Peter would have spoken Aramaic. Peter would have probably been able to read a little bit of Hebrew, and maybe he would have had just enough Greek to be able to do business. But that really would have been it. The interesting thing about 1 Peter is I had always been under the assumption that the Greek in 1 Peter was pretty low, but as I was prepping and getting ready, the Greek in 1 Peter is actually pretty good. And that kind of threw me off. So it's one of the reasons why people say the Greek's too good. No one at Peter's educational training level and regional, ethnic and sort of ethno-regional level would have been able to write the Greek that Peter did. Okay, so that's problem with did Peter write the epistles of Peter? Number one, the Greek's too good. Problem number two, he talks a lot about persecution, but we're going to get into a second of when he wrote it. The dates when he should have written it versus the amount of persecution that he talks about don't quite line up. There is the real lions in the Colosseum level of persecution that the early church experienced didn't really kick in till the 80s and the 90s AD. By the way, the lions didn't start till much later because the Colosseum wasn't even built yet. So that's my own kind of anachronistic thing. But the real sort of pressure on Christians that they were illegal, that they were in a really rough shape, that really doesn't happen in terms of the actual Roman government hunting them down until the 80s and the 90s. We know from church tradition that Peter probably died somewhere in the early to mid 60s. And I'll get a little bit more to that in a second. So now you have this problem, man, Peter talks a lot about persecution, but what was the persecution that he's talking about? There's not a lot of evidence. There's only a handful of things, right? So then people want to say, well, then Peter couldn't have written these letters. They must have been written later. The third one is that so that's the persecution problem. So we have just the Greek problem, we have the persecution problem, and then the third one that comes up the most is that the theology is too similar to Paul. And the theory behind this problem is that Paul and Peter were known, if you go back and read the book of Galatians, they actually had a little bit of a dust-up. There was some internal conflict between the two of them. And so people want to assume then, well, then why would Peter rely on Paul's sort of fancy higher Stoic, Greek, Aristotelian sort of Platonic philosophy that Paul did his theology through? Why would Peter be using that? Okay, so we have the Greek problem, we have the persecution problem, and we have the sounds too much like Paul problem. Now let me take a second and tell you why all of these are goofy, silly, stupid reasons not to think that Peter actually wrote these letters. The Greek problem. Number one, he makes it very clear that he used a scribe. That's it. His scribe was his grammar check. Now, the scribe's name was Grammarlius. That was a joke. It wasn't actually that. It was Silvanus. And Silvanus probably heard what Peter was saying. So Peter's probably walking around his room using his rough language, speaking Aramaic maybe even, and he's just quoting verses as he could do his best. And the poor guy's just doing his best. And his scribe over there is going, I don't know that I would put it that way. And he's cleaning it up for him. And then he would have read it back to Peter, and Peter would have said, yes, that sounds like what I really wanted to say in the first place. And I know some people say, well, doesn't that create a problem with inspiration? And I would say, no. Why couldn't both of them have been inspired at the same time? If what we believe about verbal inspiration, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to help make the scriptures infallible and completely trustworthy, well, why wouldn't the Spirit have worked with both of them? So the Greek problem easily solved. His scribe just knew Greek better than he did and was probably just a better educated person than him. So there you go. That explains it. Persecution references. We know for a fact from the book of Acts that Christians were culturally persecuted far before they were ever civically persecuted. What do I mean by that? Civic persecution would have been when the Roman state actually turned against Christians following the reign of Nero, following the burning of Rome, going into Domitian and Julian and some of these other emperors. Those were formal persecution of Christians. But we know from the book of Acts, at least, that there were cultural persecutions of Christians. It was just hard to be a Christian. People thought you were strange. People thought you were weird. People thought that you mean you eat the body and blood of your God? The people thought they were cannibals. People thought that they were disloyal to the Roman Empire because the vast majority of them were pacifists. People thought that they were atheists because they didn't recognize the God Emperor of Rome. All of this, before it became legal to persecute Christians, it was perfectly acceptable to not do business with them, to alienate them. And as we see from the book of Acts, under Saul, they actually were physically persecuted. The initial Jewish Christians were. We also know that under the reign of Claudius, there was a massive expulsion of Jewish Christians from the city of Rome. Put a pin in that. Remember that. Claudius' expulsion of Jewish Christians in Rome in the 40s. That actually comes in. So there were these vague notions, while it may not have been quote unquote legal or it wasn't the state persecuting these Christians, it was totally acceptable. They were the least liked group in the room. They were the ones that if you had a problem, blame the Christians. Why is our empire in decline? Blame the Christians. Why are our crops failing? Blame the Christians. They don't pray to the gods. Why did the well go sour? Blame the Christians. They don't pray to our same gods. So the persecutions that Peter starts talking about in this book aren't really civic, state-driven, or legal persecutions, but they are cultural persecutions. And then the third one, it's too similar to Paul. They were all learning from each other. That's my answer to that one. They were all learning. They were communicating with each other. They were talking together. These theologies that each of them developed weren't done in the vacuum of their own experience. Peter and Paul interacted. Peter, James, and Paul interact. Peter, James, and John and Paul interact. All of these men and potentially the other authors, we're not even going to get into the book of Hebrews, all of these people are interacting with each other. They are developing the primary theologies that will then turn into what we now call the doctrines of the church. So why would Paul and Peter sound the same? Because they believe the same things. That's it. And they are starting to use the same language because the language works and the theology is sound. So, who wrote 1st and 2nd Peter? Barring any other candidate that makes sense, I'm not even getting into the validation of the church fathers or anything like that. I'm just dealing with these three. We're going to go with the Apostle Peter, first name Simon, from Galilee. You know him. You love him. He was a fisherman. And despite what some popular television shows say, he did not have a gambling problem. He was just a guy out there doing his best. So for all you listeners and watchers of the podcast, and maybe you're driving right now, maybe you're a dad, maybe you're a businessman, and you're just a guy doing your best, this is your epistle. This one's for you, guy in the car. All right? So we know who wrote it. So then the next question really is, who read it? Who was it to, right? Who did he write it to? So it says right off of the book, right off the top, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, says to Christians, to the believers, something like that, living in these 5 cities, Pontus, Cappadocia, Galatia, as in Galatians, Asia, and Bithynia. Okay, so these are these 5 regions. It's a region of what is now modern day Turkey that's just under the size of the state of California. Okay, so it's about 129,000 square miles of region that Paul is writing to. And these cities are very sparsely plotted in this region. If you were to go look at your Bible map, you'll see this is to the north and to the west of the Taurus Mountains in modern day Turkey. So, fun fact, he's writing to the northwest. That's not true, but I feel like he's writing to us, so it's okay. And he's writing to these cities, and these cities were incredibly individualized. They were very regional, and they weren't overly Hellenized. What do I mean by that? They hadn't been really, really influenced by Greco-Roman culture. They were still sort of doing their own thing. and they were sparsely populated, and they were all cut off from each other, and somehow Peter decides, you guys need to hear from me. But who is there? Okay? Who is there is, if you roll back, how would they have gotten Christians? Like, how did Christians even make it out there? If it was rural, if it was sparsely populated, if it wasn't on direct trade routes, which if you remember from some of our other teachings, that's how Paul evangelized, to use major trade routes. How'd the gospel even get to them? It's easy. Somewhere in the 40s AD, Claudius expelled Jewish Christians from Rome because they were violating his rules of religious tolerance, okay? So Claudius made the Jewish religion legal as long as they never proselytized, as long as they kind of kept to themselves and they didn't talk their religion. But Christians were constantly talking about their religion. So Jews were able to stay in Rome and Gentiles were able to stay in Rome, but Jewish Christians specifically were all kicked out of Rome, okay? Where did they go? Most of them, under Claudius's colonization and deportation, wound up in these 5 cities. And so by trying to expel Christians from Rome, Claudius actually assisted in the spread of the gospel to more rural and remote areas. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. So these rural, kicked out, kind of backwater Christians, what happens to them? This becomes what some church history scholars later call the cradle of Christianity. And it produces leaders like Basil, Gregory, and a couple of different Gregorys who are all amazing, who show up in the 320s AD to fight for orthodox doctrine about the very identity and nature of Jesus Christ at the Council of Nicaea. This region produced some of the greatest defenders of the identity of Christ and combated and defeated the Arian heresy at the Council of Nicaea. And so people want to talk about Paul and his sophistication, and I love Paul, I read Paul, Paul's great, Paul and his sophistication. And then people want to kind of goof on Peter a little bit because of his ruggedness, because of his ruralness, because of his gruffness, all this kind of stuff. And he kind of choked when it came to ministering to Gentile Christians. He couldn't quite figure it out. But it was because he wrote a letter to these primarily, more than likely, Jewish Christians. And he wrote this letter and helped them defend and save the beginning seeds. You remember we always talk about, go back to series 1, those first couple of episodes where he talked about the gospel as a seed. He helped them cultivate the seeds of that Christianity so much that when it came time to defend Christianity from one of its greatest threats, the Arian heresy, and if you want to know a little bit more about that, you can actually go back and listen to our very special Christmas episode where I talk about how St. Nicholas slapped Arius in the face. That's a crazy story. But these guys, these men, were the ones that actually helped Christianity stay on track centuries later. So it's really, really impressive. And again, they were. What's interesting too is that one of the words that Peter uses to describe these brothers and sisters in Christ is foreigners. He calls them foreigners. Why would he say that? Because they weren't Roman citizens. That's what allowed them to be kicked out of Rome. And they were immigrants to this new area. So he's using the fact that they were deported from Rome, where they weren't considered, even though some of them had maybe even grown up in Rome, but they weren't Roman citizens. So they weren't considered Roman citizens. They weren't Jewish enough to be Jewish. They weren't Gentile enough to be accepted in Rome, right? And then most of them came from colonization and deportation. They weren't even from the regions that they lived in. So he's trying to help them understand that in the same way that you are cultural foreigners, in the same way that you are regional foreigners, aren't we all, brothers and sisters, spiritual foreigners? We're not from here. And that's why I hope you can begin to see as you're listening, you're driving, and you may even want to take a second to share this episode with someone because you're starting to hear some themes that are coming up, or you've heard a few things that are interesting to you. So take a moment, share the episode, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. But you see this theme of the spiritual deportation, this spiritual alienation, that although you are surrounded by people who look like you and use your language and talk like you and feel like they should be your countrymen, all of a sudden, because of the true kingdom you belong to, You feel like you're a foreigner anywhere you go. And I hope you can begin to see why these letters spoke to me about how Christians exist in culture today. So when did he write it? Let's talk about that. So we have the who, we have the who wrote it, we have the who read it. So when did he write it? Probably in the late 50s to early 60s AD. Why? Because if we follow church tradition, he was dead sometime in 64, 65 AD. We know that he lived in Rome off and on for about 20 years. So let's say he lands there sometime after the initial expulsion in the 40s, and then he writes this letter, but he's traveling a lot. So the fact that he was in Rome didn't prevent him from going to and visiting to any of these places. Okay, so the who, the what, the when, the where. Where did he write it from? He wrote it while he was in Rome, but he uses a code word for Rome. He says that he's writing from Babylon. Don't think that he's actually writing from Babylon. Babylon became this code word in the early church for the city of Rome. You'll see it in Peter, and you'll definitely see it in John and in the book of the Revelation. He's constantly talking about Rome. Babylon becomes sort of this metaphor, if you will, for any superpower or superculture that is directly opposed to the kingdom of God. So Babylon works not just as the geographic historical city of Rome, but it also works as a great cultural metaphor for any metaculture or superculture that is in direct, it is the enemy. It is the word that Christians use for the enemy of any given culture. And so we don't have to get into all of that today, but a lot of things, quote unquote, have been Babylon. All right. So what did he write? So we have the who, we have the when, we have the where. So what did he write? Well, he wrote a letter. That's all that it is. You say, well, why is that important? Because letters are personal. That's why I love the fact that a lot of our New Testament is letters. It's a person writing to specific people. I never want you as a student of the Bible to forget that. A real person sat down with his scribe and they really wrote this actual letter to real people to encourage them. You have to, if you really want to get the most out of the epistles especially, embrace the realness of them. Embrace the humanity of them. Now, it's all formatted properly, like a letter in the ancient world should be formatted, and as we go through the text itself, we'll get to that. But what I want you to grab onto is Peter felt the need to grab his scribe, to grab his buddy Silvanus, and to say, hey, help me write this because these guys, these women, these brothers and sisters are in trouble. I know how they feel. They're strangers in a strange land, just like our father Abraham was, and they need some encouragement because they're hurting. And so he writes the words that he writes. So it's very personal as you'll read it, both in tone and in its burden. So who, what, when, where? Who wrote it? Peter. Who read it? These scattered diaspora, foreigner, Jewish, probably still a little Gentile Christians, but people of this new kingdom in regions where they were both ethnically and sort of geopolitically not at home, but more importantly, spiritually not at home. When did he write it? Somewhere in the 50s to early 60s AD. Where was it written from? When he was in Rome, helping the church there, he wrote it to these other churches. And what did he write? He just sat down and wrote a letter to people he cared about. So the big question then is, why did he write it? Why did he write it? What's the point of it all? So whenever you look at the why of any book in the Bible, you want to ask a couple of things. You want to ask for the purpose of it, you want to ask for the themes of it, and you want to make sure that you grab one or two key verses to really help you understand sort of the heart of it. So what was the purpose? The purpose of these letters is to encourage these Christians at this crisis point between faith and culture. A great book drop that I want to mention right now is Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture. If you want to sort of find a companion guide to some of these, or Leslie Newbegin's The Gospel in a Pluralistic Society, and those will be in the link in the episode recap and the episode, all that kind of stuff. Again, why did this letter stand out to me? Because of this purpose. I believe that now we're at a crisis point between faith and culture. And there has, for many of us, people my age especially, and older, always been a place where Christians felt at home in Western culture and in America specifically. We felt at home. This was our home. We saw ourselves as the builders, the founders of the United States. We built it to protect and to preserve that sort of 18th century understanding of what Christianity should be, all of these sorts of things. This is in fact, many of the metaphors early on were, this is our promised land. And now, many of us, you're driving in the car, you're on your way to work, you are getting breakfast ready, you're like my buddy that says hi to me almost every week at church, you're headed over the pass to Eastern Washington right now, you are running on the treadmill, you feel like wherever you're at, St. Louis, you feel like a good St. Louis person, you feel like a Southerner, you feel like you feel like a New Yorker, like however you've joined us, you feel like it. But there are moments where you really don't feel welcome or at home. You feel like, and I love how Abraham articulates it, you feel like a stranger in a strange land. This letter is to encourage you. This letter is going to show you how to live in a society where people don't want you there anymore. How do we respond to the cultural and civil and popular culture, the attacks? Yeah, I'll say it, the attacks on Christianity, at the very least, the huge dislevel, the low level of comfort with Christianity to ways of just sheer disrespect of Christianity, all the way up in some forms, depending on what you do for work or how you are, maybe even a legitimate persecution of Christianity. Okay, Brian, all of that to say, how should I live? What am I supposed to do with all this? This letter speaks to you. A commentary by McKnight puts it this way: knowing your place before God so that you can know your place in society. And I like that he says that we have to understand who we are before God, before who we can really know who we are before our neighbors. And I can't try to solve the neighbor problem, the identity as an American, as a King County, Pacific Northwest person. I can't solve what does it mean to be an evangelical Christian or a Bible-believing Christian or a Pentecostal. I can't solve any of that when it comes in regards of how to be in the culture around me until I really am confident and I'm secure and I'm grounded in who I am before God. And so that's the problem. That's the purpose that Peter seeks to deal with, especially in 1 Peter. So how does he do it? He does it by exploring a couple of themes. So 3 themes I want to give you. Number 1, it's Peter really takes the task that he says, look, Jesus is ascended and he's not physically with us anymore. So how do I live now? If I don't have Jesus right here telling me how to live, how do I live? So the commentary, I can't remember her first name, but she wrote it and I thought her themes were great. And number 1, it's living in a world where Jesus is hidden from us. In other words, do I see Jesus every moment, every day, every second? Probably not. So how do I live in a world where Jesus is obscured? Okay. The second one is seeing discipleship as a journey from darkness to light. Discipleship is a journey. Discipleship is a once you were, now you are kind of reality. So how do I do that? Peter addresses that theme. And then finally, the big theme is that all victory is found in Jesus. When I was a kid growing up in the Midwest and in the South, we used to sing a gospel song all the time, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. And that really comes from 1 Peter. How can I live in victory in Jesus, both culturally, but personally, spiritually, and as we'll have a chance to see in a few episodes, even at the level of spiritual warfare? What kind of spiritual victory can I live in regards to the darkness and legitimate demonic activity, spiritual activity in the world around me? So living in a world with an obscured Jesus, discipleship as a journey from darkness to light, and then victory to be found in Jesus. Those would be the big themes that we talk about and that we look at as we continue in our study of 1 Peter. And so a key verse, I want you to go back. I want you to start reading 1 Peter. I want you to read it, then reread it, then read it again, then grab a different translation and read that. Those who are fans of the show, all you Threadheads out there, you know who you are. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a chat in the comments. If you're a diehard Threadhead, let us know that you're still with us. But you know that we use the English Standard Version here. but read it in English Standard, then read it in NIV, read it in the Message, read it in New American Standards. If you're brave enough, if you've got enough guts, read it in the King James. You might actually, there's some fun ones. So we'll have some fun with it. But I want to read the verse we started with. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10 from the English Standard. But you are a chosen race. Now, when I read this, think of everything we just talked about. Okay? But you are a chosen race. You're a royal priesthood. You yourselves are a holy nation, a people for his own possession. Okay? So all that language about foreigners and about being displaced, Peter is telling these discouraged people, these people who are broken and these people who are hurting, you are your own nation, and you're a nation that God himself made. You're not sort of a put-together nation through exile and colonization that Claudius decided where you should live. You are who you are, where you are, with who you are, because God put you together, because you are his very own. Why? That you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. It's such a powerful descriptor of the Christian journey. You are being pulled from darkness into light. And some days you may feel pulled back to that darkness, but God is calling you out into his marvelous light. Never forget, Peter says, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, talking about persecution, but now you have received mercy, but that mercy is from God. So this is what we're going to be talking about. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure that you're liking it, you're sharing it. Hit that notification bell so that when the next episode comes up, you're ready to go. We'll be diving right in to 1 Peter chapter 1 on our next episode. You don't want to miss it. Take time to like, subscribe, share the episode, and make sure you're following us on social media because of all the extra fun, goofy stuff that we do there. Hey, I'm excited about it. Thanks for joining us. Give us a thumbs up, give us a shout out in the chats, and make sure you share this episode. And that's it for today's edition of Theology Threads.